We are planning to take our Bavaria 35 Sport from Norway to Shetland, the Faroe Islands, Scotland and back home again. Before we can even think about casting off, we discovered a problem. We might not have enough fuel range for some of our crossings. Some of these crossings are over 200 nautical miles long and completely exposed to the North Atlantic. That got us thinking, do we actually have enough range to do this safely? On paper, our boat has a fuel capacity of 780 liters. But offshore, theoretical fuel capacity and useful fuel are two very different things. First of all, the fuel gauge isn't perfectly accurate. When the gauge says full, the tank usually isn't actually completely full yet. And near empty, the gauge often reaches zero before the tank is truly empty. So I think 730 liters is a more realistic full tank level. However, I realized that the pickup pipe in the tank is actually a bit over the bottom. It's not completely in the bottom. So maybe half centimeter or a centimeter above the bottom, because it doesn't want to pick up any dirt or water. So that means the actual capacity is a bit less even. By measuring the tank height and divide into 780 liters capacity, I could estimate that 1 till 2 centimeters of pickup above bottom was about 30 liters in lost capacity. So now we are down from 780 liters to 700 liters in useful capacity. However, offshore there's another problem. In rough seas, fuel moves around constantly inside the tank. If the fuel level gets too low, the pickup can briefly suck air instead of diesel as the boat pitches and rolls into the waves. And getting air into a diesel system offshore is not something we want to experience. Since offshore conditions can become unpredictable, we also want a proper safety margin. So 650 liters is more like the proper available fuel that we actually can use on our trip. So realistically, we're treating the boat as we only have around 650 usable liters per trip. The next thing I want to find out is actually how far it is across the ocean. So measuring from Skudeneshavn in Norway to Lervik in Shetland, it's about 205 nautical miles. From Scalloway in Shetland to Tórshavn in the Faroe Islands is also about 205 nautical miles. To shorten the stretch from the Faroe Islands to the Outer Hebrides, we need to stop at Tvøroyri to top off the tank, that is in the south of the Faroe Islands. From Tvøroyri and the Faroe Islands to Stornoway in the Outer Hebrides is about 215 nautical miles. So that is 205, 205 and 215, let's say 210 nautical miles between the places when we start to calculate the fuel burn towards capacity. So now we know the capacity of the fuel we are carrying over, and we know the distance. Next, I need to calculate the actual fuel burn. A planing boat like our Bavaria 35 Sport has two very different operating modes. At low speeds, the boat moves through the water in displacement mode. That means the hull is pushing water aside instead of riding on top of it. In displacement mode, fuel consumption is relatively low, but there's a catch. Every boat has something called the hull speed, a natural speed limit where the boat starts climbing its own bow wave. Once you get close to that speed, resistance increases dramatically. Our boat is quite wide for its length, which gives greater interior space and stability, but it also means the hull speed is relatively low. For us, boat is only really fuel efficient up to around 6 knots. Above that, fuel consumption starts increasing quickly until we get fully up on plane. The problem is the speed range in between. Too fast for efficient placement cruising, but too slow to follow plane efficiently. That's where the fuel burn can get really ugly. In certain wave conditions, the boat can actually feel more stable and comfortable when properly on plane compared to semi-displacement. We usually tend to like to go into plane while surfing the waves. It feels much more comfortable and we feel like the boat is thriving instead of just ducking into and out of the waves. So for this trip, we would like to go in plane instead of displacement speed. Normally, when we are traveling and going out both in our local environment and on the other trips, I see that we are about 2.7 liters per nautical miles in fuel burn. The fuel we need for this is about 567 liters, and that is well below the 650 liters we actually have in our tank. But after comparing actual distance traveled with the amount of diesel we refilled afterwards, we realized the real number was closer to 3 liters per nautical mile in normal cruising conditions. And then we need about 630 liters, and that is a bit lower than we actually have, but I think we will manage. However, offshore conditions can become much worse than a normal coastal trip. In rougher seas, fuel consumption can increase dramatically. The boat is constantly climbing waves, falling into troughs, correcting speeds, and fighting resistance from wind and sea state. That's when fuel burn can suddenly move from around 3 liters per nautical mile to 4 liters per nautical mile, or even higher. The difference between 2.7 and 4 liters per nautical mile might not sound huge, but offshore, that difference can decide whether the crossing feels comfortable or suddenly becomes risky. And now we actually need 840 liters of fuel. Summary then, is useful capacity 650 liters, but fuel needed is 840 liters. That's when we realized we probably needed additional fuel capacity. We thought we had 780 liters available, but we didn't. We thought we had plenty of fuel, but we don't. We need a solution to this. The most natural solution was to use 20-liter jerry cans. We needed about 200 liters spare. Should we buy an extra tank, or should we use, for instance, 20-liter jerry cans? But offshore, transferring fuel at sea is much more complicated than it sounds. First of all, we're talking about large amounts of fuel. To gain the same additional capacity, we will need about 10 20-liter jerry cans on board. That again takes up a surprising amount of space, adds a lot of weight, and creates a completely different storage challenge inside the boat. But the biggest issue is actually the refueling process itself. In calm conditions at the dock, pouring diesel into the tank is easy. Offshore is a different story. The boat is constantly moving, rolling, pitching, and getting hit by waves and sea spray. Trying to open the fuel filler and manually pour diesel from multiple heavy jerry cans in rough conditions can quickly become messy, exhausting, and potentially unsafe. There is also the risk of seawater or spray entering the fuel system while the fill cap is open, and contamination inside the diesel system offshore is something we absolutely want to avoid. So instead of relying on multiple loose jerry cans and manual fuel transfers at sea, we felt a proper dedicated fuel tank was a much safer and more practical long-distance solution. We needed an extra tank, but where could we place it? The engine room simply doesn't have enough space for another large tank. Under the guest bed, there are two large storage compartments. At first, we thought one of those spaces could work perfectly. But there was another issue. One of the compartments is already occupied by our upgraded holding tank. The boat originally came with a relatively small 70-liter holding tank located inside the bathroom cabinet. We upgraded that system to a much larger 140-liter tank for longer periods offshore and away from marinas. That large holding tank now occupies most of the biggest storage compartment under the guest bed. In the other compartment I had a lot of stuff, but even after removing this, measured space inside, we would only realistically fit around a 100-liter fuel tank there, which simply wasn't enough to make a meaningful difference for the crossings we had planned. So we kept thinking. Eventually, we realized the most practical solution was actually placing the additional fuel tank on top of the one half of the guest bed itself. The challenge was designing a tank that would fit the available space as efficiently as possible. The first step was taking careful measurements of the area. Once I had the measurements, I made a detailed drawing of the tank and sent it to a company that specializes in manufacturing custom fuel tanks. That allowed us to maximize the available volume while ensuring the tank would fit exactly where we wanted it. But fitting the tank was only part of the challenge. The tank also had to be secured properly. A full fuel tank contains a significant amount of weight, and offshore crossings can expose the boat to heavy motion and substantial forces. I wanted the installation to be strong enough to handle rough North Atlantic conditions. To secure the tank, I installed multiple heavy-duty attachment points inside the storage compartment below the guest bed. Each attachment point is rated to approximately 1500 kilograms of load. I then used 6 heavy-duty straps to secure the tank. Together, the straps are capable of handling forces from a fully loaded tank both side to side and fore and aft. In other words, the goal wasn't simply to stop the tank from moving under normal conditions. The goal was to make sure it remains securely fixed even when the boat is pitching, rolling, and encountering rough offshore seas. When carrying hundreds of liters of fuel inside the cabin, proper securing is not optional. It's one of the most important parts of the entire installation. To make the extra fuel tank practical offshore, I also wanted a safe and simple way to transfer fuel between the tanks without manually handling diesel at sea. So I installed an electrical transfer pump between the main tank and the additional tank. Instead of modifying the main engine fuel system directly, I connected into the generator's existing fuel inlet and return lines using T-fittings and valves. That gave me a relatively clean and flexible way to move fuel between the tanks. To make the system easy to understand and operate, I also color-coded the hoses marked with green tape transfer fuel from the extra tank into the main tank. The hoses marked with red tape transfer fuel from the main tank into the extra tank. So if I want to fill the extra tank from the main tank, I closed the green valves and then I open the red valves and switch on the electric pump. About 15 minutes later, the extra tank is full. If I want to transfer fuel back into the main tank offshore, I close the red valves and I open the green valves. Then I switch on the electric pump. About 15 minutes later, before leaving offshore, I will make sure that the valves are set in a way that it fills from the extra tank to the main tank. While doing this, I can monitor the fuel level directly on the chart plotter and watch the level in the main tank rise in real time. I have made an overview of the current percentage in filling and with the corresponding liter, and then I can just watch in the overview what exactly the current percentage of diesel fuel is when I start to fill up the tank, and then I can in the overview look at what corresponding percentage it should be when filling 200 liters. I also discovered while making this overview that I cannot fill from the extra tank to the main tank if the main tank is over 60% full. If I do this, the level in the main tank would rise and go into the breather pipe from the diesel tank and out to the sea. I also wanted the fuel transfer system to be as simple and foolproof as possible to operate. For that reason, I installed a dedicated heavy-duty switch behind the helm. Fuel is transferred. I deliberately chose a proper industry-style switch rather than a small hidden toggle switch. The reason is simple. It's immediately obvious when the system is on or off. When you're offshore, possibly tired, dealing with rough conditions, or operating at night, simplicity matters. So, where does this leave us? When we started looking at the numbers, we quickly realized that our original fuel capacity might not be enough for the kind of offshore crossings we're planning. The more we looked into usable fuel capacity, real-world fuel consumption, weather margins, and offshore safety, the more obvious it became that we needed additional fuel on board. After a lot of measuring, planning, designing, and installing, we finally have a solution that gives us significantly more range and a much larger safety margin. Does that mean we're ready for the North Atlantic? Not quite. Fuel is only one piece of the puzzle. We still have a long list of preparations ahead of us before we can leave Norway and point the bow towards Shetland and the Faroe Islands. But at least now we're a little closer. And for the first time, those long crossings are starting to feel possible. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.